Dune has been on my mind a lot lately. I'm probably not alone with that, given that a new film adaptation of the novels came out recently. And while I don't want to turn this video into a movie review, I have to say I liked it a lot. It's very faithful to the spirit of the novel it's based on. The only shame is that they had to cut the novel into two parts, so it lacks a satisfying conclusion. That shouldn't be a problem now that the sequel has been greenlit, but it was a gamble. But while the world was watching how this experiment in adapting this classic of science fiction would end up doing, my interests went elsewhere. My thoughts went to what kind of video games Dune has spawned. For the uninitiated, Dune is a 1965 novel written by Frank Herbert. Its universe is implied to be our own, set thousands of years in the future. It's usually mentioned that the story is set in the year 10,191, but that's not entirely correct. More precisely, it's set in the year 10,191 AG, which stands for After Guild, meaning the founding of the Spacing Guild, one of the many factions present in the story. It's not clear what year that would be in Earth years, but suffice to say that it's very far into the future. The novel primarily deals with interplanetary political conflicts between noble houses that make up a feudal society under the Emperor Shaddam IV. The protagonist of the novel is Paul Atreides, heir to the House Atreides, and the first book chronicles his struggle against the rival House Harkonnen, set against the backdrop of the planet Arrakis. Arrakis, which is colloquially referred to as Dune, hence the title, is a planet covered entirely in desert and is the only planet in the known universe to be the source of a substance called spice. Spice is one of the primary drivers of conflict in the novel, but it plays mostly a background role. Thematically, the novel mostly deals with politics, especially in the context of imperialism, but it also draws a lot of influence from ecology, nomadic lifestyle, as well as destiny, which manifests itself particularly whenever characters realize what things their actions are about to set in motion and then how they deal with that knowledge. And it generally follows the classic hero's journey template. Compared to a lot of other science fiction of the era, it's very esoteric and doesn't much deal with technology at all. In fact, robots and artificial intelligence are pretty much entirely absent from it. Because unlike a lot of other science fiction, the inevitable war between man and machine has already happened thousands of years prior, which led to a complete ban of so-called thinking machines in the entire known universe. Most people who even remotely know the Dune franchise will know about Dune 2, Dune 2000, and Emperor Battle for Dune. Dune 2 in particular is one of the granddaddies of the real-time strategy genre, and the latter two games follow in the footsteps of Dune 2 as well. Unfortunately, I'm not a big fan of real-time strategy games. My tendency in these games is to build as many heavy units as possible, steamroll from one corner of the map to the other, and hope that something that dies along the way is part of the intended objective, so I wasn't overly enthusiastic about playing those games. But the keen-eyed among you might have noticed that Dune 2 implies that there must have been a Dune 1 at some point. Now, unfortunately, I wasn't able to find a legitimate copy of the game to proudly show off the box. And none of the online distributors are selling the game either at the time of this review, so I had to resort to piracy to get it. Though honestly, is it really piracy if nobody is willing to sell it to me? Either way, Dune is a very strange beast indeed. While the later games were clearly real-time strategy games, this original is a weird blend between strategy and adventure game. Upon booting the game up and after watching a highly compressed bit of the 1984 movie as an intro, it immediately looks and feels familiar to anyone who has ever played a LucasArts adventure game before. This superficial similarity is however only skin deep, because unlike your typical adventure game, Dune is a surprisingly passive affair with only little input required from the player. There's no back and forth between you and the characters, they basically just talk at you. And there aren't really any puzzles to solve here either, it's mostly just about navigating a few conversations that for the most part clearly tell you what you have to do next. The only time I felt like the game challenges you to pay attention to anything in order to understand what to do next is when you have to find a settlement. And the only clue you're given is that it's somewhere near the fish's mouth, and you have to notice that if you look at the world map there's a structure that looks like a giant fish, so if you explore the area around it, you will stumble across the settlement. But other than that, the adventure game portion of this game feels kinda shallow. You can talk to characters, but there's no initiative on your part. If they have something to say about the current situation, they'll say something, and if not, you'll get a canned response telling you to shove off and bother someone else. While the narrative events that transpire over the course of the game superficially mimic that of the movie and the novel, there are distinct differences between them and the game that seem to have mostly happened to facilitate the second half of the game. I'm not going to delve too deep into the narrative here, because since the property has now become relevant again, I don't want to mention any potential spoilers for people who haven't seen the new movie yet. The basic gist of the game is that you play as Paul Atreides, and your goal is to defeat the rival House Harkonnen. But I feel like the game mostly just focuses on certain key plot points of the narrative and largely ignores much of what makes Dune special in the first place, which is the many themes it deals with. Also, the game does very little to capture your imagination the way the book did. To me, it feels like the game leans too hard on people already being aware of the narrative, either by having read the novel or watched the 1984 David Lynch adaptation, only it then alienates those very same people by deviating from the narrative pretty substantially and also omitting many of the characters from the novel and film. The most prominent way it deviates from the source material is by focusing on spice mining. Spice in both the novel and the film are just a MacGuffin. It's a means to an end, something intended to facilitate conflict. In the Dune universe, or Duneverse, spice is an almost universally useful substance. Spice can prolong life, it's used medicinally, it can grant prescient abilities, and it's the entire backbone of interstellar travel, since the guild navigators, who are highly evolved humans exposed to massive amounts of spice, need the prescience the spice grants them in order to fold space in order to find safe ways to travel between the stars. Spice is so important to the universe of Dune that it naturally lends itself to be the catalyst for a multitude of conflicts. Everybody has something to gain from the spice, and as Baron Harkonnen succinctly puts it,
"He who controls the spice controls the universe."
And while the mining of spice does make brief appearances in the novel and the film adaptation, these scenes are less about spice mining and more about what happens around it. In short, the importance of the spice in the story is diametrically opposed to the importance of the spice in the Duneverse. But Dune, the video game, puts great emphasis on mining spice. That's where the second half of the game, the quote-unquote strategy gameplay, mostly comes into play. Once you've extensively talked, or more accurately listened to everybody, you're tasked with contacting the Fremen, the native inhabitants of the planet Arrakis. You can recruit them to work for you in various roles. The first one is going to be mining spice for you, since the Emperor periodically asks you to send a shipment of spice to him. The Fremen live all around the planet in structures called sieges, basically caves carved out of the few large rock formations that manage to stick out of the endless desert. Each siege has a surrounding bit of map in which the Fremen can mine for spice. But unlike in the novels, spice is not a renewable resource here, so you have to move Fremen between sieges once their current one has been mined dry. Fremen can be also recruited as armed forces, which are used to fight back against the Harkonnen. The Harkonnen occupy much of the northern part of Arrakis, and sometimes also launch assaults on your Fremen sieges to occupy them so the Fremen mine spice for them instead of you. The goal is to defeat the Harkonnen at every fortress they hold until you can attack their palace at the end and win the game. Now this might sound like it involves strategy of some kind, but in reality it's as simple as sending a platoon of Fremen to a Harkonnen fortress and events play out largely on their own. Much like how conversations mostly happen on their own, training and fighting are also entirely passive affairs. Fights don't require you to oversee proceedings, you can simply send your troops in, and if they have a high enough proficiency and are equipped with strong enough weaponry, they'll win on their own. Similarly, once Fremen are assigned to the armed forces, they begin training all by themselves. There's no active input from you here, they'll just rise up through the experience ranks on their own. The only thing you can do to help speed up the process is relocate them to a siege where the character Gurney Halleck is present, or you can bring him with you to anywhere they're stationed at and leave him there to train them. Since he's the Atreides War Master, he's an excellent trainer. You can equip your troops with a few different weapons, like crysknives, laser guns, weirding modules, and finally atomics, but that's also a fairly simplistic and perfunctory kind of interaction you can have with them. Not to mention that again, these weapons, at least the crysknives, laser guns, and atomics, play a very specific role in the narrative of the novel, each with a certain thematic meaning attached to it that is largely absent in the game. The third occupation Fremen can have is in ecology. Turning Arrakis from a barren desert into a regular Earth-like planet is one of the stated goals of the Fremen in the novel as well, but this aspect doesn't seem like it was intended to be a viable victory strategy in the game. Planting vegetation permanently destroys the spice resources on that given patch of land entirely, which can be used to drive away the Harkonnen since they only care about the spice. But you encounter that so late in the game and it takes so much time to grow a decently sized patch of plants to drive them away that it mostly just seems like an afterthought. As I mentioned before, spice is not a renewable resource in this game. So by the time you can get vegetation to grow, the Emperor's demands are so high that you're probably already constantly shuffling around your mining crews in order to meet the stated quota, especially to parts of the map you've liberated from the Harkonnen rule. And sending your army in is a much quicker way of defeating them without also destroying the spice fields in the process. Now I've mentioned repeatedly that much about Dune doesn't really require a lot of user input. That isn't to say that there's nothing to do for the player, far from it. Giving orders to troops initially requires that you're in the same place as them, so you have to travel from siege to siege yourself. At first this happens through ornithopters, which are basically helicopters that use flapping wings like birds to fly, and later on you get to ride the giant sandworms across the desert. As you stay on Arrakis longer and are exposed to the spice, you also develop a few unique powers. One is that you periodically have visions of things happening elsewhere on the planet. This mostly serves to inform you of whatever urgent thing has happened, so you can take the next sandworm to deal with the problem. The second power it grants you is the ability to telepathically communicate with your allies. At first this only works within a small radius around wherever you're located on the planet, but by the end of the game you can communicate with everybody regardless of their distance. Well, almost. You can certainly talk to your troops, but none of the named characters. And that's quite a big deal, because whenever the Emperor sends a demand for spice, you have to travel back to your palace, listen to his message, talk to Duncan Idaho, who in this game for some reason looks like Londo Mollari from Babylon 5, and take him to the comms room to send the spice. And you have to do this every single time a demand from the Emperor comes in, which is typically between every 4 and 8 in-game days. Most of the latter half of the game is a fairly constant loop of sending in your troops to a fortress, defeating the Harkonnen there, wait for them to transform the fortress into a siege, relocating your mining crews, and periodically heading back to home base to send the Emperor some spice. So the engagement curve gradually leads downward from the beginning when the world is still new and foreign to you, which is a shame. In the end, Dune isn't that amazing of a game. It's very much a product of its time, which means that there are a lot of things that future games have streamlined since. Overall engagement and gameplay are low, and there's quite a bit of tedium involved, especially during later stages. Visually, the game is also a mixed bag. I generally like the visual tone of the game, but some of the characters like Thuthir Hawat look downright hideous. And for some inexplicable reason, they only had Kyle MacLachlan credited for his quote-unquote appearance in this game, even though Lady Jessica bears a striking resemblance to how Francesca Annis portrayed her. But everybody else looks entirely different, so why even bother? Still, I felt it was an interesting experience to go back and play something as comparatively simple and primitive as Dune, if for nothing else than the excellent soundtrack, but honestly, I wouldn't recommend you should go out and do the same. Now again, this video isn't supposed to be a comprehensive retrospective of the entire Dune video game franchise, so I won't be covering the real-time strategy games here, because I have little interest in playing them. But during my research I stumbled across another adaptation that just sat there like a siren, enticing me with her enchanting music. Everything about Frank Herbert's Dune reeked of a catastrophic failure, from the fact that I had never even heard of it before, to the abysmal critical reception, and the fact that it, along with other ostensibly terrible games, managed to tank its publisher Cryo shortly after it got released. I was looking forward to one of the biggest dumpster fires in gaming since The Fifth Element on the original PlayStation. Remind me to tackle that one sometime in the future. Now, I once again had to resort to piracy in order to present this game to you here. Since literally 0 people on the entire planet have ever bought this game, it wasn't possible for me to source an actual copy of it. And even though I did manage to download the PC version and even got it to run on a modern Windows 10 PC, at least to some extent, I decided to play the PlayStation 2 version on an emulator. Because even though the spice is supposed to turn your eyes blue, I'm not sure the rest of your skin color should follow suit. As much fun as these visual glitches might have been in the long run, I wanted to present the game how it was intended to be seen. Though granted, I'm not sure if this was how the game was intended to be seen. I'm going to be generous and give the game the benefit of the doubt and say that it's the emulator's fault that the game runs like ass, that it has a myriad of graphical glitches, and that all the conversations aren't synced with the subtitles or the animation. In dubio pro reo, since I can't verify the game's performance on actual hardware. Frank Herbert's Dune is interestingly once again not an adaptation of the novel itself, but tied to another adaptation. In this case, it's based on the eponymous TV miniseries produced by Sci-Fi, which back then was called the Sci-Fi Channel. As with a lot of made-for-TV science fiction from the era, Frank Herbert's Dune is an overall admirable attempt at adapting the material, but it falls markedly short of being satisfactory on many fronts. Not the least of which is the characteristically hilarious costume and set design that for some reason always tends to get really absurd whenever science fiction gets adapted for TV. But even if the video game leans more towards the TV miniseries, it largely ignores most of the narrative, opting to mostly focus on the part of the story where Paul Atreides is exiled. Interestingly enough, the game basically starts where the 2021 film adaptation ends. Now fear not, I won't be spoiling anything here because the game really doesn't tell anything close to what the story of Dune is supposed to be, and even what little is there is so underdeveloped that you can hardly spoil either the book or the new movie with it. Frank Herbert's Dune is one of the thousands of terrible licensed tie-in games that came out when the PlayStation 2 reigned supreme. While it still happens today that popular movies get turned into video games, this was far more common in the late 90s and early 2000s and usually meant that it wasn't worth playing because these games were either rushed to meet the film's release date or just didn't naturally lend themselves to interesting gameplay. And this game is no exception. From a gameplay perspective, Frank Herbert's Dune falls into the ever-elusive to define category of action-adventure. There's no singular basic gameplay pillar upon which you could nail it down. You mostly just run around sparsely designed and underpopulated levels, and the only means to defeat enemies is either a profoundly simplistic stealth system that allows you to execute pre-baked finishing moves, or a horrendously boring third-person combat shooting system that relies on lock-on aiming. To put it charitably, it doesn't quite manage to be an immersive sim. Shootouts basically boil down to locking onto an enemy, and if you have the space to maneuver around, circle strafe around them to take them down in a couple of shots. And if you don't have the space to evade their shots, you can just stand there and tank the damage. And that's basically it. Once you've seen one combat encounter, you've seen all of them. Encounters aren't so much designed as they're just there to give the player something to do. There are a few scenarios where you can tell that the designers attempted to give the player a means of doing it stealthily, but more often than not, combat is entirely unavoidable. That wouldn't be much of a problem if it weren't for the severe scarcity of ammunition. You have a total of 4 firearms available, and each one is almost always at risk of running out of ammo. Since the shooting is done through a lock-on system, the game has no way of rewarding accuracy with ammo conservation. So basically you have to try to be as stealthy as possible to take out enemies with your knife to conserve ammo. And if you are out of ammo, you'll have to run up to the enemies while tanking their shots like a doofus and hope to Shai Hulud that once your health bar depletes enough, the game allows Paul to use his Fus Roda to shout enemies to death. I have no idea why both the David Lynch movie and this game opted to weaponize the voice, because this just isn't something that happens in the novel. Basically in the book, the Bene Gesserit, an entirely female sect that I'm not going to explain here, as well as Paul Atreides and his descendants have the ability of the voice, which is basically just Jedi mind tricks. It can compel people to act in a certain way that the speaker intends, but it was never a sonic weapon to kill people, but I digress. If this limited gameplay wasn't already proof enough that Frank Herbert's Dune was either rushed or the designers had no clue what to do with the property, then the number of missions and their objectives should drive that home. Because there are at best 7 missions in this game, not including the tutorial, which in total lasted me barely 2.5 hours. As I mentioned before, the game starts at basically the halfway point of the story where Paul and his mother Jessica crash land in the desert. So the first mission is to just get out of the desert before the sandworm attacks them. Sounds straightforward enough. The game teaches you to only walk on the lighter colored sand because the darker sand causes you to sink into it, which slows you down. Fair enough. But then the game has the audacity to put you in front of a giant-ass sandworm and never tells you where you have to run. Going left or right invariably kills you. No, what you have to do is run towards the camera, even though you have nothing telling you that that's the direction you're supposed to be headed. The game even locks the rotation of the camera completely, so you have no way of knowing where you're supposed to be going. I guess Jessica running in the general direction of the camera is supposed to clue you in, but I had to look up the solution to my conundrum. Anyway, after that's done and you make contact with Stilgar at his siege, the next mission involves sabotaging the Harkonnen spice mining operation. This involves infiltrating a harvester and planting jammers that send an SOS signal in order to cause a carryall, which the game for some reason refers to as a carryall, to pick up the harvester. Carryalls are the airborne transports of the harvesters that fly them to and from the spice fields and also serve as a means to get the hell out of Dodge whenever a sandworm attacks. So the goal here is to cause the carryall to lift up the harvester, which, once it's airborne, explodes. Simple enough. The next mission involves infiltrating a compound to retrieve a bit of information that, should the Harkonnen get their hands on it, could reveal the Fremen's plans to them. It's mostly straightforward combat with the added twist that you'll have to be alert enough to not kill a certain character and instead lure him away by sabotaging a device and looping back around to his office to steal the information. Once that's done, you'll have to find a way to escape, which involves taking down a bunch of enemies, deactivating their anti-air defenses and stealing an ornithopter. The third mission involves making contact with the Spacing Guild in order to arrange spice payments to bribe them to not install any surveillance satellites in orbit that could tell the Harkonnen where your sieges and armed forces are located. Unfortunately, this meeting can only happen in a Harkonnen-controlled fortress, so you'll have to dress up as a Harkonnen, which fortunately makes you largely inconspicuous to all the guards roaming the place, but it takes away your ability to heal yourself. Not that that matters much, because as I said, you're largely inconspicuous, so you can just walk up to most of the guards and one stab kill them. The point here is to gain access to various parts of the fortress by finding a device that lets you change what kind of clearance you have, so it's mostly just keeping a lookout for that, as well as a bunch of codes that you can input into the machine to change what kind of clearance it grants you. It's mostly uneventful, but then there's an entirely out of place segment where you have to avoid laser tripwires for some reason. If you get caught in one, the room locks up and fills up with poisonous gas, which is an instant game over. And this game is far enough back on the evolutionary timeline that while it does have an automatic save system, there are almost no mid-mission checkpoints. So if you die here, have fun doing the entire thing from the top again. Thanks Shai Hulud, I played this game in an emulator which allows for save states. Now the reason you enter that tower to begin with is to gather a data crystal that has the encrypted flight plans of the Harkonnen. After you have the crystal and head back out, you get attacked by what looks like to be the target dummy from the David Lynch movie for some reason. Yeah, this is the game's idea of a boss battle. As with everybody else, you can just circle strafe and shoot it a bunch of times to take it out. While you were busy doing that, your love interest Chani and another character called Kalu have managed to get captured by some smugglers who intend to sell them to the Harkonnen. So off you go to the smugglers' camp, which again is mostly just a tedious sequence of rooms and hallways where you first have to deactivate a bunch of radar stations before you can make your way to Chani's cell. Before entering that cell though, there is another boss battle with the leader of the smugglers. The only catch here is that he employs a shield, which, contrary to what you might think, you should under no circumstances shoot at. If you've read the novel or seen the movie, you'll know that if a laser weapon projectile were to make contact with that shield, it would generate a massive explosion. It's kind of a dick move to put something like that into this game because it runs completely counter to what you'd normally do in a video game. I might not have mentioned it up to now, but just like the previously discussed game, Frank Herbert's Dune really relies on the fact that you've at least seen the TV miniseries or read the novel in order to, on the one hand, understand what's happening, but also know this little tidbit to not blow yourself up and restart the entire mission from the one single mid-mission checkpoint the game has. After you've beaten the boss, there's a sequence where you have to escort Chani out of the camp while under heavy fire from all the enemies that for some reason magically have manifested themselves in the previously cleared out camp. At the end of the mission, you're eventually rescued by an ornithopter ostensibly piloted by Kalu, who somehow managed to escape by himself. This is also the only mission where there's something else to do back at HQ besides preparing for the next one. First, there's a sequence involving a hunter-seeker, which the game for some reason refers to as a hunter-killer. The game inexplicably changes a lot of names around for some reason. A hunter-seeker is basically a remote-controlled assassination device that locks on to sound and movement. The goal here is to reach your weapon while avoiding the hunter-seeker in order to shoot it down once you've reached said weapon. This sequence is excruciating, and once again I'm eternally grateful that I was playing the game on an emulator where the save states prevented me from tearing out my already sparse remaining bit of hair. To any fan of the series, the presence of a hunter-seeker implies that there must have been someone nearby controlling it, because as established earlier, thinking machines don't exist in the universe at this point. Turns out that Kalu wasn't who you thought he was. He was actually impersonated by a face dancer. Now don't worry if the term face dancer means nothing to you, it's not something that even appears in the first novel or any of the movies. Face dancers are shapeshifters from the planet Tleilax, whose faction play a big role in the later novels. In this game he just serves as another boss battle where he runs around the empty siege and you have to run after him and gun him down. And just like that, you're off to the final mission already. And this one's just hands down lazy. It consists of a maze where you have to first destroy 2 cylinders to open up 2 doors, to allow you to get to 2 consoles, where you have to input 2 codes you have to pay attention to find, to open up another big door at the opposite end of the maze. Once that's done and you've decrypted the crystal with the flight plans, Glossu Raban, the nephew of Baron Harkonnen, and a couple of lackeys appear. Once you've chased Raban through the maze a bit and injured him enough, he runs in front of the statue at the center of the maze, where a single shot causes that statue to collapse onto him, thus killing him. And that's it. All you get at the end is a short sequence of Paul riding a sandworm and then the credits roll. No payoff whatsoever to what little story you've been given here. And they even have the gall to claim that the game is to be continued, as if we've just got done playing some kind of timeless classic that demands a continuation and not just one of the laziest games I've ever seen. Frank Herbert's Dune is easily one of the worst games I've played in a long time. A third-person action game set in the Duneverse could have been cool. Heck, just imagine riding a giant sandworm across the plains of Arrakis. I'm sure competent game designers could find a gameplay aspect that would work with the world and theme of Dune. Unfortunately, Cryo weren't able to do that. And that concludes my look back at 2 forgotten games in the Dune franchise. And dare I say that both of these games are rightfully forgotten. While 1992's Dune might at least be an interesting footnote in the development of the RTS genre, I couldn't in good conscience recommend anyone to play it nowadays. And honestly, do I really have to tell you that Frank Herbert's Dune sucks at this point and should be avoided like the plague? If you've managed to sit through this entire video, I want to thank you very much for watching. Honestly, I'm not sure either of these games were worth covering in a video, not when I still have hundreds of other, more modern and probably better games left to play. But the idea of covering something from my favorite book series appealed to me. And who knows, maybe I'll cover a few older titles here and there as well in the future, like The Fifth Element that I've teased in the beginning. Or hell, maybe I'll finally deliver on my promised look back at the Banjo-Kazooie games that I've mentioned in my ukulele review. Or maybe I'll cover something completely different that you might have never even heard of. Who knows? The only way to find out is to subscribe to this channel. Until next time, bye bye.